Hello and welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Countries like to feel that when seismic events happen, they are financially protected. And most do this by investing in either gold or in dollars. They buy the greenback because it's been solid for so long, thinking that in times of trouble, they'll be okay. But is that era of the dollar as the world's reserve currency coming to an end? This is Roundtable. Now, instead of looking to the West and to the USA, there are those casting their eyes eastwards to a growing and increasingly powerful China.
The US dollar is the king of all currencies. It's the world's favourite reserve currency. That's the money held in large amounts by central banks to make international payments or transactions. More than 60% of all foreign bank reserves are in US dollars. But the US's dominance is being challenged, and its share of global trade is steadily shrinking. The United States comprised 40% of global GDP in 1960. Today, it makes up 25%. So some analysts are asking if it's time for America to rethink the role of the dollar. Could it deliberately abandon its dominance as reserve currency king? Right now, it can borrow cheaply and its banks benefit. But exports are more expensive, so other countries are less likely to buy goods labelled Made in America, and that costs jobs and trading income. And if dethroning the dollar seems unthinkable, analysts have pointed to other ways the US has repositioned itself in recent years. Abandoning international agreements and multilateral commitments. The slow death of the dollar has been predicted before, and it shows no sign of happening yet. But for how long can the world bet on dollar dominance?
Very pleased to say that we can go to New York, say hello to Richard Wolff, who's Professor of Economics and founder of Democracy at Work, and then to London, where we say hello once again to Inderjeet, Professor of International Politics at City University, London. You'll both have a thought on this, but Richard, let me start with you, if I may. What is in the US for being a reserve currency? What does the US get out of it?
Well, it's part of the dominance of the United States economy for much of the last century. World War I changed everything. The United States went from the major debtor to being the major creditor of Europe. World War II cemented that dominance because of the destruction in Europe and the relative lack of it in the United States. And we all know the history, or most of us do, ever since. So the dollar's dominance is part of the United States' dominance. And the benefits to the United States are enormous. The world uses the dollar as its basic currency for international trade and exchange. It allows the United States to flood the world with dollars that don't come back as demands on American goods and services. This is a subsidy to the entire American economy. And so it only worked to enhance the dominance of the United States, which is why the decline that we are now facing is so difficult and so painful here in the United States.
So the corollary to that is what would happen if, as you suggest, the dollar's decline continues and it is no longer favored as a reserve currency? What would the downsides be for the US?
It would be the loss of that subsidy. It would mean that the United States cannot function the way it has. Imagining that the Federal Reserve, our central bank, for example, can do pretty much what it wants because the rest of the world is forced to adjust to whatever supply of money they print and to circulate, whatever interest rates they charge. The United States would then shrink into becoming one among many economies, and all the subsidies, direct and indirect, from being the world's currency would be taken away. And so it's a kind of feeding on itself. The decline of the empire undercuts the power of the currency, which in turn furthers the decline of the empire. That's where we are. And that's a very difficult situation that has much to do with explaining the behavior of the United States, which I suspect is puzzling many.
I'll get you to explain subsidies in a bit more detail a little bit later, but let's bring in Inderjeet. Do you see it as more than just a badge of honor?
Well, absolutely. As Professor Wolff said, it is a very, very powerful basis of an American global role and position, which is occupied for a long time. And I think what I would say is that when you look at the foreign holdings of foreign currency or foreign banks' reserves, 60% of all of those reserves of foreign banks are in dollars. 40% of all US debt is held abroad. That debt equals something like $14 trillion, and the Chinese hold about $3 trillion of it. So what we've got is a currency which is respected by its peer competitor economies. It's held by those economies, and that maintains its strength. And it also means that more than a badge of honor, it actually enables American military power and geopolitical strength to be exercised around the world. So the US, therefore, can wage relatively cheap wars in Afghanistan, for example, for 19 years, in Iraq, which is very, very expensive, because other people are basically giving them their money, buying US treasuries at very low rates of interest.
So why is it losing its burnish? Why is it not quite as bright as it used to be internationally?
Well, I would take a little bit of an issue in the short run. If you look at the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis which that has inaugurated, um, more people are buying dollars than they're buying any other currency. The strength of the dollar has gone up against all its peer currency rivals. So, if you like, it remains a store of value. It remains a secure place to keep your money, secure currency in a crisis. And therefore, I'm not sure that in the short run, the United States has actually lost any of its burnish. You could look at the politics of the United States and the political leadership as destabilizing America's predominant position in various ways. But if you look at the Federal Reserve, it moved very quickly as soon as the crisis broke out in order to make sure that international currency exchanges and so on could carry on during the COVID crisis.
So what would you say to Richard after what he told us?
Well, what I would say is, in the short run, it remains very powerful as a store of value for others, and in the longer run, once the global economy and other economies recover from the pandemic, and if as the United States does relatively weaken relative to others, I think then it's possible that other currencies like the euro, maybe the renminbi, may strengthen. But I'm not sure how long that's going to take. At the moment, what you can see is there's great power interdependence amid rivalry and competition.
I'm going to throw that back to Richard in just a moment, but for the benefit of our viewers and indeed for you guys, I'm not going to try and say renminbi very often because I find it almost impossible to do so. We will refer to the Chinese currency as yuan in the same way that we talk about sterling and the pound, if that's okay with you. But Richard, Inderjeet seems to be suggesting that he thinks what you suggest is a little bit exaggerated.
Well, I think perhaps we can disagree or agree to disagree a little bit. I agree with him that in the short run, people are behaving the way they have for a long time. That is, going into the American dollar as a safe haven, as a safety place. But I think that's mostly a matter of habit. It's a matter of not yet wanting to face up to the realities. It's not just we in the United States that don't want to face up to what's going on, as you can see from our president, but it's the rest of the world also that takes time to adjust. Let me underscore, though, what is the reality over the longer run. Over the last 25 years, the Chinese economy, to pick the key example, has grown on average 2 to 3 times faster than the United States. This is an extremely successful economic development program. Very few like it in the history of the modern world, or any history as far as I know. And the challenge to the United States is obvious. We have seen over the last several years Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, and many other countries beginning to either think about or actually to substitute international trade settlements in currencies other than the dollar. The commitment of those countries to move in that direction is now explicit, and I believe it is already underway, a bit more than we know, and that there will be a lag, but that more and more countries will begin to understand that the world has changed. And one further point: the pandemic is a shakeup of the world economy whose consequences are going to take time to play out. But underlying all of that is this differential performance of the Chinese and American economies, the continuing difficulties of Europe to function as a competitor rival to the other two. I think you're going to see that the United States' steady decline along all measures will be reflected in the decline of the dollar as the international currency.
Inderjeet, I mean, you've taken a close look at what China's been doing. I'm sure you agree with an awful lot of what Richard's saying. But if countries are moving away from the dollar, are they moving towards the yuan in the short term with a view to something big changing in the long term?
No, they're not. I think when you look at what percentage of Chinese currency is held by anybody else in relation to the dollar and the euro and so on, I think the yuan is about 3%. That is nowhere near competitive with the dollar or even with the euro. So what we've got is the possibility of future change and the probability of it, I would say. But I think we're living in a kind of transitional phase, and the direction of that is not entirely certain. We can sort of look at Chinese economic growth and development, but it's never a linear process. We know that Japan also was on a kind of a very, very fast trajectory in the 80s and 90s and has stagnated ever since. And its currency hasn't done particularly, is a good store of value in some ways, but it hasn't really challenged the dollar. So it's not a clear cut to me that anybody wants to hold the yuan as a kind of reserve currency for themselves in any big way. And I don't think it certainly isn't a challenger to the dollar.
Well, let's go back 75 years. Richard, I'll come to you in just a moment again on this one to say what you would like to in reply to what Inderjeet has said. But 75 years to a place in the east coast of the United States, Bretton Woods, an agreement set up there after the Second World War, to which you've already referred, made the dollar the world's reserve currency. And there's a guy called Ben Steele who's written a book called The Battle of Bretton Woods. He's Director of International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. You probably know the book. And he had this to say: the Chinese loved the Bretton Woods story. They see us here in the United States as being the British of the 1940s, a declining imperial power facing economic and political problems that threaten its global position. And they see themselves as being the Americans of the 1940s. Do you believe that the Chinese see this as an opportunity, Richard?
Yes, I think the Chinese do, and I think the United States sees it also. And I think that a good part, not all, but a good part of what you have observed in the effort of the Trump administration with its tariffs, with its trade war, with its provocations around the Huawei Corporation, TikTok, WeChat, and all the rest, a systematic effort to slow, to stall this decline that I'm talking about. I think people are aware of it, and they're aware that as the United States declines, the threat of an alternative Bretton Woods, one built around some other currency or basket of currencies, threatens the United States, and that the benefit the United States has gotten from the interaction with China over the last 30 years. And of course, there is lots of interdependency. The problem is there was interdependency between Britain and Germany and between the United States and Germany and Japan and so on before World War II. And the rivalry balance with the interdependence can cut both ways. I do believe that we're in that process, even though you're quite right that unforeseen events or struggles between them can slow or even stop the process. But for the moment, seems clear to me that yes, the yuan is not yet the international currency, will not be anytime in the immediate future. But the direction of change, that I think is not only clear, but it is now governing the political caution of the Chinese and the aggressive provocations from the United States.
You see, Inderjeet and Richard as well on this one, it might be that President Trump, and we don't know if he's still going to be where he is at the moment in 6 months' time, but it might be that he who wants to put America first, create jobs, etc., thinks that they're paying a price for being the world's reserve currency because in this situation, strong dollar, exports cost a great deal more. People aren't buying American goods as much as they might. So he might think it's in the country's best interest, perhaps, to allow this moving away from the dollar situation to continue.
Well, certainly before the COVID-19 pandemic and the increased value of the dollar, President Trump was wanting to keeping interest rates low in order to ensure that the dollar remained relatively weak and therefore American exports would be more attractive. But since then, he's actually now extolling the virtues of the more powerful dollar for his own kind of electoral interests, given the economy has tanked. But there clearly is a price to be paid to be the number one hegemonic power, because then you have to supply, if you like, the public goods. You've got to be the guarantor of the international system militarily, financially, and in other ways. You've got to underwrite its institutional structures as well, like Bretton Woods and all the IMF, World Bank, and other things that came out of it. There are some prices to be paid, but the United States has probably garnered a lot more dollars that have come back in than they have put out. If I may just go back to something which Professor Wolff very interestingly argued, I think there's a kind of paradigmatic debate here to be had. And I'm not sure that Ben Steele, when he says that China is the US of the 1940s, waiting to take over from a declining power, I'm not entirely sure what his evidence base is for the idea that China has ambitions to knock the United States off the top spot.
Well, let's put that to him. Richard.
Absolutely. Yes, I think it's a very open question. I think the Chinese are cautious for precisely the reason that they don't want to provoke the United States, a declining power, to do something, if you can allow me, to do something rash, to do something stupid, to do something irreversible to stop the process. And that the United States is doing much in its power to demonstrate to the Chinese and the world that they are quite capable of doing all kinds of unforeseen, unexplained, unusual, provocative kinds of actions. The Chinese do understand that so far time is on their side and has been for a good quarter of a century now, with no end of that process in sight. They're doing better in managing this pandemic than the United States is, and I'm being very polite by saying it in that way. They know that if they can keep the situation from exploding, then they will, in the long run, be better off. So yes, they are not in a rush to displace the United States. That would be a very dangerous policy, given not only the nuclear weapons the United States has, but the destabilized political situation, which is itself unraveling in this country, no matter what the election results turn out to be, that you're dealing with a country that is unstable and becoming more so. You have to be very, very cautious. So you have the irony that even though the direction of change, I believe, is crystal clear for the decline of the United States, You have the Chinese tiptoeing around to let the process continue as it did, not provoke a big symbolic change, and now having to adjust to the United States, which also sees the same direction but wants to stop it and doesn't really know how.
So the Chinese, if I could try and simplify this, are perhaps waiting for the house to fall down rather than kicking down the front door.
That's right, and are worried that the United States will be indelicate, to be as polite as I know how, in handling its own end of empire.
The United States might actually have booby-trapped the house. Inderjeet, what did Giscard d'Estaing, who went on to become president of France, but when he said this was finance minister, mean when he described being the world's reserves currency as an exorbitant privilege?
Well, it is an exorbitant privilege, I would say, that imperial power rests on a wide range of foundations. And I think the American empire probably is incomparable to previous empires because it has, if you like, full spectrum dominance. I'm talking about culture, economy, finance, diplomatic, military, and other. And I think that is going to take a long time to decline fully, as Professor Wolff argues. And I'm not sure, I would go back to that last point that I was making, that I think China is not just not wanting to provoke the United States. China doesn't have the power to do anything very much. It has one naval base other than on its own territories. It has 2 aircraft carriers against America's, 11. It doesn't have a string of military bases all around the world. It doesn't have a kind of an armed, like a Warsaw Pact type military camp. It doesn't have an ideology which is broadly shared. It doesn't have a culture which people want to embrace very much. And it's still a developing country in terms of the standard of living of its own population.
Although it is expanding in the South China Seas and the Spratly Islands, etc., etc. It's extending its military power outside what many claim to be its own waters.
But David, exactly right. That's a bit like saying America is very powerful in the Caribbean and the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The fact is that that's China's neighborhood. That's a normal nation's state security buffer which they're dealing with. They're dealing with their own backyard. That's different from expanding. What is America doing in China's backyard, in the Persian Gulf's backyard, in the North Atlantic backyard, South America's backyard, and so on? It's an imperial power. It has the ability to extend its powers in all kinds of ways far from its shores. China does not. China's still a developing country. It still has
which is why perhaps Richard says it's quite happy to play slowly, catchy monkey, etc., etc. But do you see a time, Richard, when the greenback, I've got Hamilton on one, I've got Lincoln on the other, when it actually is regarded as second-rate currency?
Absolutely. I think empires have a long history of not wanting to see their own decline, of underestimating the risks that the imperial position they occupy has been eroding for a long time. I agree with everything that was said about the difference in military power, bases around the world, all of that. But those things, as were said also before, those things are expensive. And the United States under Trump and the GOP basically would like to hold on to their imperial power, but not spend as much money because they can't afford it. They want the people they dominate to pay more of the price. It reminds me of the British Empire wanting every colony to be financially self-sufficient so the British could get whatever they could out of each colony without having to pay for the administration of the colony. That is not a sustainable arrangement, and I think the United States is trapped now. It cannot afford to maintain the empire it built, and it can't afford to let it go. But the rest of the world is not going to permit that ambivalence, if you like, that situation to go unchallenged. And even if the Chinese don't want to provoke the United States, clearly they're going softly, has already provoked the United States, And I think that's because of the recognition that the balance between the benefits and the costs of being an imperial power are coming home like the chickens to roost. And in the United States, that is frightening a society that counted on the benefits being greater than the costs of its empire, and find that no longer the case.
And there were so many things we were going to talk about, but we don't have the time. Listen, but it's been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Inderjeet. Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you, wherever you happen to be watching this program. Well, at least I hope you've been entertained. I certainly have been educated as well. From me, David Foster, from the team that put all of this together, goodbye for now, but you can always drop in on our YouTube channel to see this and other episodes of Roundtable going back several years now. That's TRT World Roundtable on YouTube. Hope to have your company again. But for now, goodbye.